Coming out of the cold today, but there's just something about the popes and the emperors that make being in this cold weather worthwhile. Come on, y'all. It does. All the love and that they had for each other. A deposition here, an excommunication there. I mean, it's very nice. And speaking of going to hell, let's talk about Frederick II. I know, yes. Thank you for mentioning that. There is no lack of circulation of warm water there. But that is, in fact, the fate to which he was rendered by some. According to other ideas, however, he was one of the greatest of all rulers, certainly one of the most known in medieval history. He is a Holy Roman Emperor, but as King of Sicily, he has even something of a greater reputation. And when you consider the fact that by medieval standards, Sicily was a pretty open society in the sense, of course, that he had advisors, not merely Christian, but some skeptical. And I mean that as a philosophical school who really doubted any truth could be known. Muslims, Jews, and, God forbid, Orthodox, as opposed to Catholic. So he was definitely someone who was open to a variety of ideas, and he was a well-educated man. I think having a lot to do with that background in Sicily. It just wouldn't have happened in Germany. As King of Sicily, a slight problem arose in the empire, and this gets a tiny bit complicated because he is just a little boy, an orphan little boy at that. Well, little boys can't be elected Holy Roman emperors. You got to be of age. And as a result, the Pope of the day made a decision to have someone else become Pope. This was the famous Pope Innocent III. Yes. Pope Innocent III. And so what you have is, well, of course, they are relatives. You'll remember from last week that Frederick Barbarossa was actually a combination of the Swabians and Saxons. So in a way, this person is related. His name, Germanically enough, was Otto, and Otto was made emperor. Eventually, he displeased Innocent, and he was deposed. One might wonder about this, but when you get power, when you get that kind of position through the Pope, you can lose it by the Pope as well. If you recall, his mother Constance, that is Frederick's mother Constance, was a very devout Catholic. The story is that she was pulled out of a convent to get married. If that's the case, we are not surprised that when she knew her own health meant that she wasn't going to live much longer, she basically said, well, now, my son is going to be ruler someday, and I know you'll look after him. And of course, Innocent said, naturally. And part of looking after this boy is, as Innocent is growing up, as children do, the Pope says, now all you have to do is sign right here, promising that you would never try to combine the empire and Sicily. I think Innocent III actually believed him when he said he would never agree to that. He would never agree, that is, to uniting those southern Italian territories with the empire, and maybe he meant it at the time. But later popes would find that once he was made emperor, when Otto displeased the pope, Frederick II sort of said, well, you know, this isn't too bad. This is kind of nice. And he would put it off. Procrastination. I do intend for these lands to remain separated. I just need a little more time to get all the paperwork and get everything. Again, you know there's something up. This man, Frederick II, is quite devious. All in all, it looks like a nice bit of territory over which Frederick II rules. And if you just call him the wonder of the world, Stupor Mundi, you can, Carol, you remember that? Stupor Mundi, like stupendous and mundane, yeah. Thank a Latin teacher. So, right? Wonder of the world. I had to get that in before you could get away. Stupor Mundi, that's what he was called. That was sort of like, because he was such a strange and interesting individual. But on paper, at least, he had lots of land. You understand, not necessarily directly, and I doubt visits to Germany were much fun to him. His heart was in Sicily. And considering the weather and other conditions, I think you can well understand that Sicily offered a much more pleasant atmosphere for this kind of individual who enjoyed lots of different kinds of people, different ideas, and by and large, he could be very open-minded. Now, he would not tolerate heretics. And I'm sorry to have to bring that up after talking about being associated with free thinkers and skeptics and Muslims, but heretics, no. You know, you just reach your limit with a heretic. And what's wrong with being a heretic? It's kind of not patriotic. I mean, I believe this, and if you're going to be a Catholic, you got to be my kind of Catholic, okay? If you're a Muslim, that's a whatever, but a heretic is just bad news. So, but he tried in other respects. They are the only ones who do not bask in his warmth. And so, with the empire, he said, in that darn middle part of Italy, that really would be so nice, purple. You know? And I know Uncle Innocent didn't want me to have it, but maybe as time goes by, those memories are fading. So he had hopes that maybe later popes would be perhaps more fearful, more accepting, but as it turned out, neither. Their attitude hardened, as did his. Well, I mean, he had sons, and he had made no plans to separate the lands, so they kept saying, let's see it. What is your plan? What are you going to do about this? How are you going to keep these apart? And he kept putting it off. And the popes after Innocent III were even tougher than Innocent III was. And that means very tough. In other words, you do it to me, and I'll do it to you in spades. And you'll be sorry you crossed me. If the papal propaganda office became very busy because emperors don't need harems and menageries. That's just not fitting, okay? That's the only word. But he had a variety of animals. He had a collection of special friends that went with him who were not necessarily of the Catholic faith. And all this exotica did a lot of damage, as I'm sure the papacy had hoped. But again, you got to have an idea that this fellow was not exactly concerned about that kind of thing. He wanted to be a major figure, and he didn't care whether he was notorious. Well, there we go. And a writer. Yes, there are not many medieval emperors who are also writers. If somebody ever finds out that that was ghostwritten, I will be crushed. But I have never, like the way I was, profiles in courage, it just died, when I go. Because I so believed in that book. But anyway, the art of hunting with birds, falconry, was, of course, the sport of the nobility. And to think that this, complete with illustrations, was his work, is a fascinating example of a man whose intellectual curiosity knew no bounds. Have you ever asked yourself, what language did Adam and Eve speak? Okay, how do you find out? Well, let's get some new children, new babies, fresh out of the womb, and get them nursemaids who are mutes. Yeah, so basically you can bring them up and find out as the children get older what language they'll start speaking. Right, okay. In addition, have you ever seen a soul? Do you want to? Okay, we'll get one for you. It's lucky they had so many convicted criminals available, because anybody want to volunteer for a soul experiment? So basically they put some people in a barrel and tape it all up, and I imagine it gets a little noisy after a few days. People go, let me out, and say, you'll be out soon enough, just calm down. I would need some praying if I were you. Because they had the committee to observe the barrel because they wanted to see when the soul left. And Frederick was there, Mr. Skeptic, saying, see, I told you there wasn't a soul. Don't see it, do you? You just hear a bunch of screaming and kicking in there. And so, another successful experiment. But wait, have you ever wondered how fast your food digests? So, oh yeah. So he had an experiment. He brought out some prisoners. Again, another volunteer said, too bad they couldn't get back the word to these fellas. It's better just to stay in the cells. Don't volunteer. But he said, okay, we're going to get a nice dinner for both of you. And they're going, wow, this is so much better, than the chow back in the prison. So he says, now one of you will go on a long run. He says, yeah, I think I could use some exercise, and now the other one, I just want you to rest and have a nice nap. He said, yeah, all that food did get me kind of sleepy. Well, that's not the end, because it's dissection time. After your run and after your nap, we've got to check the food progress. Yeah. So, another life given to science. Okay. So, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, he didn't do it. I mean, he had it done. He sponsored it. He doesn't, I mean, it's like, the point is, there are not a lot of people at that level who are that interested in anatomy and other aspects of, shall we say, pseudoscience. So, is this papal propaganda against an individual they loathed and detested? Maybe, but certainly he did sponsor this book on falconry.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so we know that, and along with the many universities that we'll talk about later that were founded by the church, he decided he wanted one of his own, so he founded one in Naples. He would not take second place to church-based institutions. Because of his role in this romantic painting from the 19th century, I suspect will be familiar to some of you as Virgil and Dante are making their way through the waters of the Styx, and lots of damned folks are asking for a little support, a little TLC, not getting much. But we're going to have it, but how about being an emperor in hell? This is the ultimate compliment, I would think, because Dante represents him as a figure of damnation. Dante doesn't often agree with popes, but in this case, they found him ideally suited for a circle in the realm of damnation. He was, according to Dante, materialistic and anti-Christian. As far as we are concerned, his primary interest is that by an accident of birth, he was heir to both the empire and Sicily, creating enormous problems for the papacy of that day. And because of what was considered a scandalous personal life, he would create much controversy. Seem to be having there we go. So that's even more beautiful. Now you see, if Frederick could have lived there. So we're back. It is rather ironic that we will meet his mother in paradise. So sometimes that happens in families, you can get, but don't worry, she doesn't have to worry about it because in heaven you don't think about bad things. And so she thinks, so she's not up there in heaven thinking, God, my son was such a loser, a damn loser to boot. So it is the idea then that he really is the wonder of the world when you think about such an individual having so high a place. But as we note that, we are... Oh, yeah, there they are. It's a little busy, but it makes my point that you see there his mother, she has the crown. And Dante is there with Beatrice. And you don't see a bunch of people clutching and grabbing at them because these are the saved. We're in paradise. Oh, well, I can't do anything about it. So, young man. Okay. Technology, yes. Okay. Well, we'll have an intermission, and while we do, I will note that this is by no means the end of the story of Frederick II and Sicily. There is much more to be said about it, but in the main, we should know this. By his focus on the empire, on Sicily rather, the empire will be more and more divided, split. He had to give the princes of the empire more freedom because he wasn't there to oversee them. The result is going to be less and less imperial power. So that's going to be a big old mess for the next few centuries until finally somebody puts it out of its misery. As you know, Voltaire saying it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So, as far as Sicily is concerned, that will continue to be troublesome for the rulers, and it will not be, in fact, a concern for, it will never stop being a concern for the popes. So the saga of Sicily will continue as well. As far as the popes are concerned, the issue there is simply they had gotten as political as everybody else. And that's really difficult when you're in a position as head of a church. You can say, well, they did it to me first, so now I'm doing it to them. And some did claim that popes had the right to excommunicate or even depose an evil ruler. But when it seemed so framed in terms of political activities, then it really hurt them. And I think it's fair to say that the power of the papacy in a spiritual sense was definitely lessened by their adventures with Frederick II. It became so bad, in fact, that we hear of situations that the other rulers were standing up for Frederick against the Pope. That's how, they just all sort of felt threatened. If he can do it to that one, why can't he do it to me? Now, this gives, in a nutshell, as I see them, the results. A political papacy, a papacy with more and more involvement in the world and less ability to rationalize what they're doing. Frederick II, with little interest in what was going on in the empire. I'm sure he wanted his revenues, but he didn't want to be involved with it, and that tends to make the empire more and more divided. And of course, finally, the rule of Sicily, who is in the end going to control that valuable and very wealthy area. Okay, can I go straight to it? No, I guess I can't. But we're going. We're going to get there. We're ready for France. Yeah. We should.
Was Dante and Frederick II sort of living at the same time, or?
Close. Dante, Frederick II died in 1250. And I think Dante was born in 1265, if memory serves. So yes. Oh, everybody knew the stories of Frederick. And you remember Dante was from Florence, so anybody who was Italian would have a great deal of knowledge about Frederick and all of his comings and goings. I mean, you think all of this, of course, is not the official view of the Catholic Church. It's merely the view of the one-man writer, and I'm thinking of all the things he could have been damned and in hell for, which one will fit my story the best? So I think it was being the materialist, because a lot of people think, well, maybe it was for violence or something else, but you know, when you got so much to pick from, that was fine. We put him there, because that was a good section. Now we're going to talk about France and England. I choose France first so that I can connect the two as we move through them, because they have, as much as I guess they hate to admit it, just an inextricable connection. They're so tied together thanks to events such as the Norman Conquest. And we never want to forget that as we go through. Let's start with what we call France, but people in the medieval world would call it the Western Carolingian territories, because it's not France yet. It won't be France for a long, long time, but we'll still use the word. Here is how it all begins. When the Western Carolingian line of Charles the Bald, some of you will remember him from the fall. When that line ends, the great nobles of France elect Hugh Capet. It is an elective position, at least initially, and his territory, the Ile-de-France, was in fact rather central for the rest of those territories, and was probably the reason he was chosen. The early Capetians, who begin with Hugh, are not well known as people, but a map tells the tale. Now, this will show you the major areas of France, and look at the little blue spots. See the sky blue? All right, that's the territory of the King of France. Now, yeah, I know. You say, gosh, he's just a little shrimp. Well, isn't that kind of the point? I mean, you know, you can be king, but you also know your place. In other words, you are a king, but not a big king. So, and then look at, Aquitaine or Brittany, Anjou, Burgundy. Makes you thirsty, doesn't it? And all of these wonderful territories, and you're thinking, wow, now those are some big deals. They were, but technically they will be vassals to the king. Oh yeah. Being le roi is good. It may not make you that powerful. That will be up to the future rulers to determine what difference it makes. But the fact is, if you've ever wondered why Paris is the capital of France, now you know. It's because it was the city of these rulers, and it grew up from there. The territories were vastly separate, and I know that many of you all have been to France, and you know yourselves, if you haven't been out of Paris, it's like coming to America and just going to New York. There's a lot more to it. I like the Aquitaine area myself because that was English for a long time. But whatever the case, it is and does contain many, many different parts. And these rulers will have a lot of assets, including, of course, the location of their lands. Scholars sometimes believe that if the Capetians' lands had not been where they were, they would have been essentially run over or taken over by someone else. The feudal authority seems to make, at least some believe, a great deal of difference, because you've got to have some kind of power, at least theoretical. And that power is, for example, you don't invade the lands of your lord. That would be pretty rude. So the idea being that I have these rights and I am your king, and so therefore I'm entitled to a certain degree of respect. And so from that, they derived great advantages. And as we will see, there will be other advantages because of that sort of authority. The church, for the most part, loved the Capetians. France would be called our dearest daughter in Christ. And that's very affectionate, I guess. And of course, there were sometimes they had problems, but in general, the idea is the French kings stand for peace, stands for the maintenance of law and order against fighting warriors. So they provided the support, that is to say, the church could for the monarchy, and that would be substantial as time went by. This is always mentioned in explanation for the Capetian success. But even more importantly, I think, when you come down to it, they had an unbroken succession of male heirs until 1328. And that's a lot of male heirs. That's a lot of generations. Because when you think about all the things that could have happened, but it didn't happen that way anywhere else. So this is extraordinary, from 987 to 1328. So that's a lot of years that there is father, son, father, son. We'll get to 1328, don't you worry, and you'll see what happens then, because that will definitely change things. The first great king who is known in detail, because how many have a biography? A biography written by his most trusted advisor for the benefit of his son. It's sort of like saying, kid, your dad was one of the greats, and let me tell you about what he did. I should say something about his nickname. Yes, I don't think we would consider that very polite now to call someone Louis the Fat, but in fact, they tell us that being fat was a sign that you got to eat well. And we're dealing in a world that most of us cannot imagine living in, when most people are pretty emaciated and weak looking and experiencing low life expectancy. So that this man, who apparently was sized so that he would have to be put on his horse. Oh yeah, that it's good to have helpers, right? So I can imagine that was quite an operation for Louis the Fat. And he was, according to many, a great founder of the monarchy. And there's the paperback to prove it. Now, Suger of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, which you can see outside Paris suburb. I think it was the scene of, sadly, a scene of a lot of the violence that we've heard about so much recently. But Saint-Denis was the site of a great abbey, an abbey, in fact, where until the French Revolution, the bodies, remains of the kings were kept. Unfortunately, during the Revolution, the revolutionaries had other plans. But as Abbey of Saint-Denis, he became, Suger, the king's great minister. And we read the stories. I wish I had time to, but you just have to read them for yourselves, about this great and pious king is dashing about the Ile-de-France, attacking the wicked and caring for the churches, and more or less the Christian hero. And of course, this is the kind of image that they wanted to present. What is important, I think, to note here for us is that he couldn't do it outside his own lands, outside Orléans, outside the area of Paris and its suburbs, because then you get into someone else's territory. You say, but he was the king. Yes, but in that situation, he is a feudal king whose power in other people's lands is limited. So he just can't go beating up on folks in their land. Beat up on folks in your own land. Thank you very much. And he does, because the idea is he helps the good and the humble, fills the hungry with good things, and wherever there are evil devils in castles and such, he will be there to get them, because he is the anointed of God. That is a start. That is a start. We're in the 12th century now, and that's the best we can do. And that's Louis XVI. But he thinks there's one thing he can do that will last, and that will be create a special marriage. This, in fact, is the Abbé Suger of Saint-Denis, and here is what Suger and the king were up to: planning a highly significant marriage for the king's son, also Louis, the future Louis VII. And here is that wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of arguably the most famous women in medieval history, and certainly one of the most spectacular because of what she did and how involved she was in so many different worlds. A major figure in politics as well as courtly love, so it's said. Eleanor was the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine, and by happenstance was the only living child of the Duke of Aquitaine. I doubt we would be talking about that if there'd been a male heir. You know how that goes. That's just reality. But as it turns out, the Duke had to consider the best path for her and his duchy. And when the king and Suger said, what would be great is to have your son marry my daughter. And of course, the king and Suger are just drooling. Yeah, that would be good. We would just love to have her in Paris and look after her and just want to take good care of her. We just love her. She's such a nice person, all that. So this is a marriage based on politics, and it will be one that will be, shall we say, considered a masterstroke by the French, but as we will find out, is in fact a terrible error. It was said, and it's one of those things that you wish they had said it, whether they did or not, that Eleanor said, I thought I'd married a man and I married a monk. Well, Louis was a very pious man, but he left off the piety enough that they had daughters. So something was going on, because I mean, they didn't just come through the prayer. And it seems to me that it's just a case of incompatibility. Louis and Eleanor would remain married for some years, and yet when they were able to obtain an annulment of their marriage, Eleanor, in the parlance of today, began dating Henry II. If we want to call it being swept off your feet, okay. Henry II of England is going to marry the, well, I was going to say previously married, but I guess if you're annulled, it didn't ever happen, right? So, the available Eleanor, because you see, now the Duchy of Aquitaine is restored to her since her first marriage was annulled. Some people say it was a blessing in disguise. I'll say that it was probably a mistake from the beginning, that the King of France was not ready to undertake the rule of so large a duchy as Aquitaine. And another factor we always bear in mind is the fact that it's probably about the production of male children. Because you know what the Duchess of Marlborough said back in the 19th century when she had, her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Some of you may have heard that story of Blenheim Palace. I had the heir and the spare. I had 2 boys because that's what you're here for. You are to produce. That's your job. And she had 2 daughters. Both of them would be significant, noble women of the Middle Ages, but that's not it. So I wonder if that did not have some effect on the end of that relationship. Whatever the case, she now married Henry, King of England and Duke of Normandy. A very, in fact, pivotal move in the transformation both of France and in many ways of England as well. Right. I just got the most wonderful question, and I'm going to start with it because it brings back so many wonderful memories of graduate school, and because I dealt a lot with this in my dissertation. It's the question of England's feudal relationship with France. Because someone pointed out, how can you be Duke of Normandy and King of England simultaneously? It can be tricky. It can be very tricky, and let's take a look at how that came to be. Henry II, a well-known figure, and I'm sure there are other movie buffs out there who think about Peter O'Toole and The Lion in Winter when I bring this up. I guess he's my favorite, Henry II. But he was a fascinating individual with an equally fascinating spouse in Eleanor of Aquitaine. His long reign led him, or leads us, first of all, to consider how we got there. So it takes us back to the Anglo-Saxons and how they achieved their England. The Anglo-Saxon peoples, Angles and Saxons, who came from areas that today we would call Jutland, Denmark, and further north, came into the South and eventually settled as conquerors and established, as you can see, in various kingdoms. Kingdoms that would be eventually united as the Anglo-Saxon peoples found their kingdoms, for the most part, destroyed by Danish invaders who were kind of following them. They were also going south. And you can still, as you go through England, find remnants of Danish peoples. It's kind of interesting to think about that too was a major invasion, because there have been 4 successful invasions. This is a good question for dinner parties and cocktail parties. Who are the successful invaders of England? Well, you start with the Romans, and then the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Danes, and then we will finally see who our 4th is. But for the time being, simply to note that all of this will be politically united by, of course, the ruler that everyone learns as the truly great ruler of Anglo-Saxon England, Alfred. This will allow the various kingdoms to be united together. They are bringing together Danish and Anglo-Saxon peoples into one kingdom. So, that will take place in the 10th century. And with Danes, Angles, and Saxons, at least in name, united as one kingdom. And if you see the other areas and wondering, why can't they come in too? Well, I'm sure they had other ideas. And we're looking at, of course, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, as I know you know. But we will see that will change. But for the time being, we've got these English territories being united. And then there was Normandy. Normandy, as you know, is a particularly beautiful part of France. And because the Dukes of Normandy have a kinship relation to a king of England, the king after Alfred, I think he's about his great-grandson. And this individual, who was canonized, you can call him Saint Edward, Edward the Confessor. I think it was one of those thank you gifts to when every king, every country deserves a saint. And so he got his because he and his wife, he just said basically, let's just be friends and pray. And so according to pious tradition, Edward the Confessor and his wife did not live together as true man and wife. And so, as a celibate couple, then the throne was wide open. His cousin, his mother's great nephew, claimed that Edward wanted him to be the heir to the throne of England. And this is William of Normandy. So they are not strangers. Edward the Confessor had Norman blood, and William was now the Duke of Normandy. And he had his sights set on being King of England. You say, but he's already Duke of Normandy. That doesn't stop you. More, more, more. It's like Duke good, King better. And it's not that he was all just gooey-eyed about England, because I think he spent most of his time in France. But he wants it, and he's determined to take it. Edward's brother-in-law, whose father had been a powerful English nobleman, now decided he would be king. Now you say, where's he getting his big status? Oh, he's the king's brother-in-law. Remember I told you about the wife? They pray a lot? Okay. Well, he kind of supervises the government. And whenever his sister says, oh, we had a nice chat last night after prayers, and he told me he wants to do this. Oh, thanks, sis. And he gets all that down so he can control it. So he was running things. So when poor Edward dies in 1066, he leaves the throne to his brother-in-law. So says the brother-in-law. So we have a disagreement between William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold, who calls himself king. William calling him a lying and wicked person. So we have a disagreement, and this means that, let me see, there is now William.
What makes William in Normandy think he's heir?
Well, he is related to King Harold. He is related to King Edward. Edward's mother was the sister of William's father. So they are, just say there is a blood relationship and not worry. And so he said, we got together one time, and Edward, we were just talking. He said, I want you to be king. Oh, gosh, thanks, Eddie. That means the world to me. So, it's that kind of thing. And he said, well, Harold's promised that he would recognize me too. And so they had all kinds of reasons for their assertions. I'm sure someone was lying, but the truth, in many ways, is going to come out in the battlefield. And for reasons that I'm not getting into, Harold's English forces will be defeated by an invading Norman force, and that's number 4. This is the last of the successful invasions of England. Take that, Hitler. Because this will be the last one in the 11th century, the Normans, who successfully invade England. And Harold, of course, dies in that famous Battle of Hastings. And have any of you all been to Hastings? It's an interesting little town to visit, and there's some, I don't think it's a bad place at all. I mean, they call themselves a beach, but if you've been to Daytona and Jacksonville, don't get your hopes up. But I just think it's nice, nice little walking trips, and there's a place. You've been there? William built a monastery there because he was good to monks, because he knew he would have much to answer for when Judgment Day came. So he was probably trying to improve his record. So yeah, he was very good to monks. So William the Conqueror, who is now King of England, and as such, he initially reached out on a program of English and Normans need to be close, and let's all work together for a bigger and brighter tomorrow. But the English have this hell no, we ain't forgetting attitude that finally the Normans just got sick of them and just said, okay, you don't want to play ball, then you lose your power. This is called one of the greatest real estate revolutions in history, because a whole class of English individuals lose positions as bishops, as nobles, and that means you lose everything that goes with it too. And that's very important. Who goes in? Normans. Yeah. Because the king now will say, well, I just can't trust the English anymore. And does everyone here think that's très bon? Yes, because language is going to change too. It will be a French-ruled kingdom. And people say, oh, wow, what is this going to do for the masses? Nothing. But they'll stay right where they are, and they can speak all the English they want because they don't have any effect on this. But the ruling classes, the bishops, the great lords, are now French. And this culture and society will remain that way, until the 14th, 15th century. So it's a long time that kind of civilization, shall we say, will rule over England. Now, you notice he brings with him the Norman principles of feudal law that I've talked about before. Some scholars will argue about this. Did the English already have the feudal ideas? But most believe that the idea of fighting for land, in other words, the fief is the gift, the loan from the Lord to the vassal for fighting, believe that was imported by the Normans into England. And he gave his great lords, and then they gave theirs on down, land or fiefs for fighting. That was the way it all worked out. And so that gave them a lot of land, both in England and in Normandy. So now you talk about commuting. These folks were doing some serious commuting back and forth. Because it's not like, oh, wow, we're in England, we'll never go back to Normandy. Oh, yes, we will next week. We've got a whole group of wars. We've got people to kill. We've got wars to fight. Yeah, I mean, far from moving permanently. They want to keep it. So they are definitely in a position now, they think, to maintain this dual role indefinitely. Now, William's heir, Henry II, of whom we have already mentioned, his lands are in that mustard color. And you'll say, wow, now we have gotten some of that Ireland, yeah? By that point, Have you ever heard that expression, beyond the pale? Something's beyond the pale. That's because of Dublin, because they considered that to be dangerous. You know, caution, Englishmen going beyond Dublin can be hazardous to your health. I mean, it's like, that was sort of considered wild country. But the idea that under Henry, the English had moved into that particular area, that's true. And you'll see they still are not quite ready, and that's going to take a while longer, to take the area that we call Wales today. And that too will come. And of course, beyond Carlisle and Durham and all that, that too is further than Henry's reach. But that's really not what we're concerned with. We're more concerned with, after his wedding to the heiress of the Duchess of Aquitaine, he's got himself a lot of lands both in England and France. And that's what called, after his father's title, Anjou, the Angevin Empire. It's, as you can see, very sizable, and he rules all of that territory. But the term empire can be a little misleading, because you might think it's all united into one neat package, and it's not. Each one is separate. He's Duke of Normandy, he's Duke of Aquitaine, he's Count of Anjou, he's King of England. So he has a variety of different titles. And you cross from one area into another area, you're dealing in a whole other world of customs, traditions, language, weights, measures, what have you. But for convenience, the history books always call it the Angevin Empire, because he was Count of Anjou, which is Anjou being near Normandy. So, you got Normandy, you've got Anjou, you've got Aquitaine, you've got Brittany, some of it. You see Nantes down there. So, all of that is very nice. Probably nicer on a map than it was, because it's not easy to rule all of this. You say, well, gosh, what do you think the King of France thought about that? Not good, I can tell you that, because he's married to my ex. And you know, this could be troublesome at social events. And they do come up. They do come up, because remember, Henry is his vassal. Yes, yes, it's very unpleasant. Because how much do you think? He's Duke of Normandy, he's Count of Anjou, he holds all those lands from the King of France. So don't you king me, buddy. At my court, you're a duke, so get down. Yeah, you have to be on your knees. You kiss that ring. I'm the king, buddy. Well, you know, like kind of, yeah, but I married Eleanor. Take that. You know, and so it's kind of a strange situation, to say the least. He is king in England, but he's not king anywhere else. He has all these other titles, and he's whatever he is in that particular title. And in that area, he is the vassal of the King of France. But for all of that, an annoying vassal of France, and one that is going to be a powerful enemy. Lord of Ireland, King of England, Duke and Count in France. Henry's land holdings, as vast as they were, should never let us forget that in terms of the development of the common law, one of England's greatest gifts to the British, the Americans, and to many other people in the world, was majorly developed in this period because of his development of a royal court system of sorts. In addition, we find the beginnings of a royal financial office, which lasted until the 19th century, and it's called the Exchequer, which allowed royal officials to bring in their revenues to official counters to make sure that everything that was there was there. And the records of that institution are among the most significant medieval financial records that we have. They're called Exchequer rolls. So this idea of the common law and the financial exchequer are merely two of the most significant developments in English government during the 12th century. But to make it so confusing, sometimes, you think, well, was there an exchequer in all those lands in France? No, this is just England. So that's an entirely separate government and legal system and all the rest. So even though we call it Angevin Empire, if you ask me, it's just a term of convenience because it's all ruled by this king. And this is the man who I think probably got up every day to think, how many more ways can I hate Henry II? He is the son of Louis VII, but not Eleanor. But he understood that his father had not had a very easy time of it getting knocked around by Henry II, because, let's face it, Louis VII kind of stands in the shadows. Philip II, who is known in French history as Philip Augustus, would indicate by his nickname that he was a strong and powerful ruler. He may not have looked that way, but he was, in fact, very, very effective because he acted not just against the king, Henry II, but since Henry was getting older, he acted in other ways. You might call him a co-conspirator. A co-conspirator with whom? Well, with Henry's wife, Eleanor. That was not a happy marriage. And sometimes Eleanor would be involved in rebellions against her husband. The sons, I guess they just couldn't wait for Daddy to drop, were often involved in conspiracies against their father. And all of this was encouraged by the King of France. Yes, I know you've suffered. Your dad hadn't done you right, and I've seen it. Can I help? That kind of thing. So he was a real piece of work, that Philip II, and he worked to try to mess things up for the English kings as much as possible. Yeah.
Philip.
Yes.
You said he's the son of
Louis VII.
But I thought Louis was celibate. Is that not the celibate guy?
No, that's not the celibate guy. That's Edward the Confessor.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we got Louis. Yeah, he needs to not be celibate. Okay, that's job number one. Don't be celibate. Okay, I mean you can pray. That's good, but don't be celibate. More or less, when we think of what was done to Henry during his later years, you might say it's karma. He might have had it coming to him, considering the way he treated his wife and considering the fact that as he was aging and as his sons were of age, he did not want to yield any of his power to them, and I'm sure they were encouraged by their mother. But all of that said, this played in many ways into the hands of the King of France. So I think in addition to everything else, Philip II had the joy not only of seeing his own power increased, as we're going to see, but also bring some vengeance on behalf of the memory of his father, Louis VII, who had had such a terrible time.
Joe, did the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire ever play any role in the rivalry between the English and the French?
Oh, yes. Very much. I mean, Henry II's daughter was, in fact, the mother of that Emperor Otto I was telling you about a bit earlier, when the Pope decided to put in Otto of Saxony. Well, his mother was the daughter of Henry II of England. Just think about it. Yeah. Just build you a mental tree and put them all in their little places. So you got Otto Saxony, and then he's the grandson of Henry II, and we're about to meet his Uncle John. Yeah, John. And you say, well, John which? Just John. He doesn't get a number. Yeah, it's kind of sad, just John all by himself. I did omit his older brother, Richard the Lionhearted, because I am going to spend more time on him when I get to the Crusades. But as we all know, let me see this. I'll give you the statistic. He spent 6 months in England during his whole reign, and that was going on fundraisers. Because he needed money in the worst kind of way, because remember, Crusades, and they don't pay for themselves. And so we need those good monks to cough it up, not just with prayers, but with offerings. And so, so he was busy. And so the younger brother then became king, that is John, younger brother of Richard the Lionhearted, became king in 1199. A fascinating ruler, and one who definitely had to do with popes and emperors and all the rest. By now, thanks to marriage, and of course their allegiance to Rome, it's kind of hard to see how they could not have been involved with popes and emperors when you think about it. But they have often said the Norman conquest increased the amount of involvement, that if they'd stayed like a Danish monarch, or something of that, if the Normans hadn't taken over, that connection would probably not have been as strong. But now, gosh, Henry and Eleanor had a lot of children. They had 4 sons and 4 daughters. And so you can imagine in the process of marrying the daughters, all the different relationships that would have been established there, connections. In any event, King John was a great patsy now for Philip II of France. Philip II of France and John are really contemporaries, because Philip II had been a young man when Henry II was king. Remember now, he was the son of Louis VII, as John was the son of Henry II. Tree, think tree, and see the little limbs coming down. So it's a question of finally now they are ready to consider, what can I do to John? He had used John so often to plot against Henry. He had used him to plot against his own brother Richard. When Richard was away at crusade, John said, "Oh, I just got a letter. Richard's asked me to kind of take over indefinitely, and I don't think his health is all that it should be." And you know all of that. John was just a little worm, so I think there were big plans, and John fell into every trap that was set to him. Disastrous is the way that I characterize it. He had problems from France. He had problems from the Pope. And last but not least, he had problems with his own nobility, leading to that document we all know and love, 1215, Magna Carta. That, in effect, would create for France a great day, because much of the land of Henry II would now be lost to France. And you say, well, it was French anyway. Well, that's looking backward, isn't it? I mean, you can't really say that at that time it wasn't. But thanks to John's errors and Philip's great success, much of that land, including Normandy itself, would now go to the French crown. And as a result, John would have problems. It all started, and this sounds so romantic, doesn't it? He was in his French lands, and actually I think he was looking for another wife. He was married, but for whatever reason, I guess she hadn't had any children. So he's looking for a wife, and one of his vassals' daughters was very attractive, right age, about 16, and so she seemed like an ideal choice. So he asked her father. His father said, "Oh, Your Majesty, well, thank you very much. I'd love for Isabella to marry you." But as it turned out, she had already been promised to another vassal. And I know you romantics out there will say, "Oh, they're broken love. They'll never recover. This could be another great love tale." No. I think it had more to do with the vassal being insulted, because he had already gotten prior rights on this young woman. And so the idea that the king, well, that hurt my feelings. I'm insulted. How dare you? So when the king, that is the King of England, would not step down from this arrangement, then the vassal appealed to the court of John's lord. Did somebody hurt your feelings? Tell Uncle Philip all about it. I'll make that nasty John pay for hurting your feelings. So you say, well, that's really weird, isn't it? But John is the vassal of Philip. So if your vassal, if you act ugly to your vassal, what is your vassal going to do? He's going to appeal over your head to your lord. My lord hurt my feelings. Now what do you think about that? I guess I better do something then. So he orders John to his court, and John, predictably, doesn't go. So now Philip, just thanking his lucky stars, declares all of those lands confiscated. Yeah, basically says you don't have a right to have these lands because you have acted in a manner that was improper for a vassal. John will say, think so? Then come take them. Well, Philip will do a pretty good job of doing just that. He will take over Normandy, Anjou, with his own forces, leaving John with what we would have to call remnants here. And here we have it down appealing to the French king, because if you mistreat me, then I will appeal over your head until you get to the Lord of Lords. But you see, in France, John is not the Lord of Lords, if that makes sense. So, he ignores it, and the victories just keep on coming until nothing is left except, it's still nice, Aquitaine. Think of that wine. Yeah, that's wine country. That is some really, I think that's still true today. That's one of their major products. A beautiful land as you're going on down towards Spain. That's really nice. But you might say, did the English now renounce all those lands? No, they said basically, we'll get it back tomorrow. Don't you worry. We are not going to accept this laying down. He hurt our feelings, but we're not ready to give it all up. Yeah, I know. I could not find a map that I thought was starker. Just stark. What do you think William the Conqueror would say? Think he'd be hurt? Angry? Both? It's like, it all seems so wonderful, and now this. Aquitaine is nice, I keep telling you, but if you're French, it just makes you want to burst into the Marseillaise, maybe, but like, we're taking it. I know people didn't know they were French yet, but we'll help them. They'll learn to appreciate being French, but that's the way they lose the English, and how the French gained so much land. But the conflict between the kings of England and France, based on the English possession of so-called French land, is now far from over. And finally, the nobles are more than a little irked at their King John. He has, in their view, abused their rights, taken advantage of them, and in the process, been a big old loser. And the business of Magna Carta is best seen as a feudal document which later generations, later centuries will use for the rights of all. But at this particular time, these are the rights of John's feudal subjects, whether they be bishops, whether they be the great nobles, whether they be the cities, rights that, of course, are considered fundamental today. But this document of June 1215 probably would not have come about had John been not such an egregious abuser of his nobles' rights, and at the same time have lost out in so many conflicts, to the extent that now the demands on him were very, very large. And so, almost months before his death, he put his seal, unwillingly, on this document at Runnymede. And of course, you can imagine when he left, he's going, I was just kidding. I don't want to do this. And he died still fighting about it in the following year. And we'll pick it up there next week. Thank you.